There's a cemetery in southern Alabama that doesn't appear on any official maps. Local families know where it is, tucked behind a stand of water oaks about 3 miles from what used to be the Belmont estate, but they don't talk about it much. 19 graves, marked with field stones instead of proper headstones. 17 of those stones bear no names at all. The two that do tell a story, historians spent 140 years trying to forget. One reads, Margaret Elizabeth Bellmont, 1829 to 1856, beloved daughter. The other, placed so close the stones nearly touch, reads simply, Cora. No last name, no dates, no epitaph, just Cora. They were buried on the same day within hours of each other, and the minister who performed the services refused to speak of it afterward. When he died in 1873, his journal from that period was found burned in his fireplace, only fragments remaining. One legible line survived. God forgive us all for what we allowed in the name of order. What happened between Margaret Bellmont and the woman who cooked her meals represents something the antebellum South could not acknowledge without destroying its own foundation, not a crime in any legal sense. Something far more subversive. Two human beings recognizing each other as equals in a world that made such recognition an act of treason against everything civilized society claimed to believe. Before I take you into the world of Belmont House and show you exactly what kind of love can grow in soil meant only for domination and submission, I need you to do something. If stories like this matter to you, stories that dig up what America deliberately buried, stories about real people who felt real things despite laws telling them such feelings were impossible, then subscribe to this channel right now, hit that bell, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because I want to know how far the truth can travel when we finally let it speak. Now let me take you to a place where silence was enforced like law, and where two women discovered that some truths are too powerful to stay buried. The summer of 1853 arrived at Belmont House like a fever that wouldn't break. The air hung thick enough to choke on, and the heat made even thinking feel like physical labor. This was southern Alabama, 40 miles inland from Mobile, where cotton grew in endless rows and Spanish moss draped from trees like widows' veils. Belmont House sat at the center of 800 acres that James Belmont had inherited from his father, who'd built the estate in 1808 using money from the slave trade and the unpaid labor of people he considered livestock. The main house rose 3 stories, white columns gleaming in the brutal sun, every architectural detail designed to announce wealth and permanence. Behind the grand facade stretched the working plantation, cotton fields, tobacco barns, the overseer's quarters, the stables, the smokehouse, and off to the east, separated by 50 yards of crushed oyster shell path, the kitchen house. That separation was deliberate. Cooking fires couldn't be allowed near the main residence, but there was another reason for the distance. Kitchen houses created spaces that existed outside the master's direct observation, and in a system built on constant surveillance, such spaces were dangerous necessities. Margaret Elizabeth Bellmont had arrived at this estate as a bride in April 1853. She was 23 years old, the second daughter of a Mobile shipping merchant who'd made a fortune but lacked the social standing that came with old money and land. Her marriage to James Belmont, 41 and widowed 2 years prior, solved problems for both families. James needed a wife to manage his household and provide heirs. Margaret's father needed a son-in-law with plantation credentials and political connections. Love was never part of the negotiation, because in their world, love between husband and wife was considered a pleasant accident, not a requirement. What Margaret discovered during her first months at Belmont House was a loneliness so complete it felt like drowning. In Mobile, she'd been surrounded by sisters, cousins, friends, the constant circulation of social life in a port city. Here, she had house servants who couldn't speak to her as equals, neighboring plantation wives who visited once a month to exchange gossip as stale as their perfume, and a husband who treated her with distant politeness and expected nothing from her except competent household management and eventual children. She'd been taught to embroider, to arrange flowers, to play piano adequately, and to never express an opinion on anything that mattered. No one had taught her what to do with the hours that stretched like years, with the silence that pressed down like a physical weight, with the terrible understanding that this was her life now, forever, until death. Cora had been born at Belmont House in 1827, making her 26 when Margaret arrived. Her mother, Dinah, had been the plantation's head cook until she died of cholera in 1850. Cora had learned everything from her mother: how to butcher and preserve meat, how to bake bread that rose properly in humid heat, how to prepare the elaborate French dishes that planters considered marks of civilization, and most importantly, how to navigate the impossible space between the demands coming from the big house and the reality of what could be accomplished with available resources. She managed 4 other enslaved people who worked under her direction in the kitchen house. She woke at 4 a.m. to start fires and often worked past midnight during harvest season when James entertained business associates. The work was brutal, dangerous, exhausting. Burns were constant, cuts were daily occurrences. The heat of the cooking fires, combined with Alabama summer, made the kitchen house feel like standing inside an oven. But Cora possessed something rare in slavery, competence so complete it created a fragile form of security. James Belmont valued her the way a merchant values reliable equipment. He'd never sold her because replacing her skill would cost more than keeping her, and that cold economic calculation had kept Cora and her younger sister Patience at Belmont House, while others were sold away when money got tight. Cora understood perfectly that her safety depended entirely on remaining useful, on never giving cause for complaint, on being property that functioned without disrupting the master's peace. She lived her life around that understanding, every decision filtered through the calculation of risk. The kitchen house itself was Cora's domain. James Belmont rarely visited it. The overseer, a man named Garrett, who managed field operations, had no reason to supervise domestic workers. This meant Cora spent her days in a space that was, by the standards of slavery, almost autonomous, supervised from a distance, but not constantly observed. It was exhausting work, but it provided something precious: room to breathe. Margaret's first weeks at Belmont House followed the expected script. She wrote letters to her sisters describing her new life in terms calculated to sound content. She supervised house servants with the uncertain authority of a new wife. She endured James's infrequent physical attention with the resignation her mother had taught her to consider womanly virtue. She tried very hard to believe this was happiness, or at least as close to happiness as women of her station could expect. But by June, the pretense became impossible to maintain. James began taking extended trips to Mobile and Montgomery, handling business that kept him away for weeks. Margaret found herself alone in that enormous house with no one to talk to except servants who were forbidden from treating her as a person rather than a mistress. The other plantation wives lived too far away for casual visiting. She had books, needlework, piano practice, and 14 empty hours every day to fill with activities that felt increasingly meaningless. She began walking the grounds more frequently, telling herself she was familiarizing herself with the estate. But her walks kept ending at the kitchen house, drawn by sounds of activity, by the smell of bread baking, by the sense that something real was happening there, while the rest of the plantation existed in careful performance. Cora noticed, of course, noticed that the new mistress lingered near the kitchen house longer than necessary, noticed the way Margaret watched the work with an expression that didn't quite match the usual distant oversight of white women inspecting servants. Noticed, and was immediately wary, because attention from the master's wife could mean danger as easily as anything else. The first real conversation happened in early July. Margaret had come to discuss menus for a dinner party James was hosting. She found Cora preparing pastry dough, her hands working with the kind of practiced precision that comes from years of repetition. Margaret had intended to give instructions and leave, Instead, she found herself watching those hands, the sureness of the movements, and something about it made her stay. "How long have you been cooking?" Margaret asked. And the question was already improper because it acknowledged Cora as someone with history, with skills acquired over time, with something resembling a profession rather than just assigned labor. Cora's hands paused for just a fraction of a second. She was intelligent enough to recognize the shift in tone, careful enough to be suspicious of it. "Since I was 8, ma'am," she said quietly, her eyes on the dough. "My mother taught me." Margaret should have left it there. Instead, she said, "She must have been very skilled." "She was, ma'am." "Do you miss her?" The silence that followed felt dangerous. Cora looked up then, meeting Margaret's eyes for just a moment before properly lowering her gaze again. But in that moment, Margaret saw something she hadn't expected. A person. Not a servant, not property, but someone with feelings as real and complex as her own. "Every day, ma'am," Cora said finally, her voice barely audible. "Every single day." Margaret left the kitchen house quickly, her heart beating strangely fast, feeling like she'd done something reckless without understanding exactly what. That night, lying beside her sleeping husband in the humid darkness, she kept thinking about that moment, about the way Cora had looked at her, about the grief in those 3 words, "every single day." She told herself she was simply being kind, taking interest in the people under her care. But kindness didn't explain the way she kept replaying the conversation, didn't explain why she wanted to go back to the kitchen house the next day and the day after that. Over the following weeks, Margaret's visits became routine. She'd bring needlework or a book and sit in the corner where the heat was less intense, ostensibly supervising but actually just present, just watching Cora work and occasionally asking questions that started as innocent and gradually became more personal. She learned that Cora could read, taught secretly by her mother, who'd been taught by a previous owner's daughter before such education was explicitly criminalized. She learned that Cora had a sister who worked in the house, and that both of them lived in constant fear of being sold apart. She learned that Cora had been in love once with a man from a neighboring plantation, but he'd been sold to Mississippi, and she'd never heard from him again. And slowly, carefully, Margaret began to share her own truth. She spoke about Mobile, about the life she'd left behind, about sisters she missed desperately. She spoke about books she'd read when her father wasn't monitoring her education, about ideas she'd encountered that made her question everything she'd been taught about the natural order of society. She spoke about her loneliness, about feeling trapped in a role she'd never chosen, about the terrible understanding that her entire life would be lived in service to other people's expectations. Cora listened with the careful intelligence of someone who'd survived by reading people perfectly. She recognized in Margaret something unexpected, genuine unhappiness, despite privilege, a desire for connection that transcended the roles they'd been assigned, a hunger to be known as a person rather than a position. What Margaret wanted, Cora slowly realized, was to be seen, not as James Belmont's wife, not as a mobile merchant's daughter, not as the mistress of the house, but as herself, whatever that might mean beneath all the layers of expectation and performance. And in seeking that recognition, Margaret had turned to the one person in her daily life who seemed fully present, fully competent, fully alive in a way that the distant plantation wives and the carefully differential house servants were not. For Cora, the situation was terrifying. She understood that Margaret's attention could destroy her as easily as protect her. Any hint of impropriety, any suggestion that she'd failed to maintain proper distance, could result in sale to the Deep South, could result in whipping, could result in separation from patients, could result in death. She should have maintained absolute boundaries, should have deflected every personal question, should have kept Margaret firmly in the role of mistress and herself firmly in the role of property. But Cora was also lonely. She'd grown up at Belmont House watching people disappear, sold, dead from disease, escaped and never heard from again, worked to death in the fields. Her sister Patience was younger, quieter, still learning to navigate the impossible requirements of slavery. The other kitchen workers were even younger, and they looked at Cora with a mixture of respect and wariness because her position gave her authority over them within the narrow confines of their shared powerlessness. Cora had no equals, no confidants, no one who saw her as anything other than the cook or the master's valuable property. When Margaret looked at her with actual attention, with genuine interest, something in Cora responded despite every survival instinct screaming warnings. She found herself answering questions more honestly, sharing observations about the world that she'd never spoken aloud, making Margaret laugh with dry comments about the absurdity of plantation life, and that laughter felt like a small act of rebellion against the heavy silence that governed everything else. By August, they'd developed a rhythm that both recognized as dangerous, but neither could quite abandon. Margaret would spend hours in the kitchen house, ostensibly supervising, but actually just existing in Cora's presence, watching her work, talking in a way she couldn't with anyone else in her life. And Cora, despite every rational calculation screaming at her to maintain distance, found herself preparing special dishes. Small, delicate pastries, elaborate preparations that she claimed were practice for upcoming dinners, but that both understood as something else entirely: offerings. Gifts presented within the only framework available to them. The physical contact began so gradually that neither could identify the exact moment it transformed into something unmistakable. Margaret would reach for ingredients on high shelves at the same moment Cora did, their hands touching. Cora would steady Margaret when she stumbled on the uneven kitchen floor, her hand remaining on Margaret's arm a moment longer than necessary. Margaret began touching Cora's shoulder when she laughed, letting her hand rest there, feeling the warmth of skin through fabric. They were creating intimacy in a world that insisted such a thing could not exist between them. Margaret had been raised to believe enslaved people were fundamentally different, incapable of the refined feelings that defined white womanhood. Cora had been raised to believe white people were fundamentally dangerous, incapable of seeing enslaved people as fully human. Both were discovering that everything they'd been taught was a carefully constructed lie, designed to sustain a system that required those lies to function. The first kiss happened on an August evening when the heat had finally broken and rain was coming. You could smell it in the air, that electric anticipation before a storm. Margaret had stayed in the kitchen house later than usual. James was in Montgomery and wouldn't return for 3 more days. The other kitchen workers had been dismissed for the night. Only Margaret and Cora remained, and the isolation felt both dangerous and inevitable. They were standing near the window, watching dark clouds build on the horizon, and the space between them felt charged with something that neither had words for. Margaret turned to Cora, and her expression made everything clear. What she wanted. What she'd been wanting for weeks without allowing herself to acknowledge it. Cora should have stepped back, should have remembered every lesson about survival, should have recognized this as the moment that could destroy everything. Instead, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to Margaret's with a gentleness that acknowledged both the desire and the absolute impossibility. The kiss lasted only seconds before they broke apart, both breathing hard, both terrified, staring at each other in the dim pre-storm light. The weight of what they'd just done settled over them like something physical and suffocating. "We can't," Cora whispered, and her voice carried all the fear of someone who understood exactly how much she had to lose. "This can't happen." "I know," Margaret said, and she was crying, tears running down her face. "I know it can't, but I don't care anymore. I can't care anymore." But Cora had to care because the consequences were not equal, had never been equal, could never be equal within the world they inhabited. Margaret's ruin would mean scandal, divorce, shame, return to her family in disgrace. Cora's ruin would mean the auction block, the whip, separation from patients, possibly death. The mathematics of risk were not remotely comparable. They should have stopped there. Any rational person would have ended it. But loneliness and desire don't operate by rational calculations, and the next time James left for one of his extended trips, Margaret came to the kitchen house after dark, when the other workers had gone to their quarters, when only Cora remained to bank the fires and prepare for morning. This time the kiss was not tentative. This time they did not pull apart after seconds. What followed over the next months defied every structure that governed their existence. They developed elaborate deceptions to create moments alone. Margaret claimed she needed to learn cooking for better household management. She sent kitchen workers on unnecessary errands. She began taking her meals in the kitchen house instead of the dining room, saying the heat made the formal dining room unbearable. The house servants noticed but said nothing because white people's business was dangerous to observe, and because Margaret's favor toward Cora seemed to make her more generous with everyone, which created a fragile protection for them all. James, when he was present, noticed only that his wife seemed less melancholic than she'd been in early summer. The household ran smoothly. The meals continued to be excellent. He was pleased that Margaret had finally adjusted to plantation life. The idea that his wife and his property were conducting a relationship that made a mockery of everything he believed about natural order never crossed his mind, because such things were literally unthinkable within his understanding of the world. What Margaret and Cora built in those stolen hours was as real as anything can be under such circumstances. They talked for hours, shared every thought, learned each other with an intensity that came from knowing discovery meant destruction. Margaret brought books to the kitchen house and read aloud while Cora worked. Poetry, mostly. Wordsworth, Keats, Byron. Words about beauty and longing that took on new meaning when spoken in that space. Cora taught Margaret practical things: how to judge when bread dough had risen enough, how to tell if meat had spoiled by smell and touch, how to do real work with her hands. Work that produced something tangible rather than the decorative accomplishments her Charleston education had emphasized. In those moments, the roles of mistress and slave dissolved into something more fundamental. Teacher and student, two people learning each other. But the reality of their situation never truly disappeared, no matter how much Margaret wanted to pretend otherwise. She could convince herself that what they shared was a relationship between equals, that love somehow transcended their circumstances. But Cora never had that luxury. She was always aware that Margaret could, with a single word, have her sold or punished. Always aware that her sister's safety depended on James Belmont's satisfaction with the household. Always aware that their intimacy existed only because she was skilled enough at managing the kitchen that her occasional absences and distractions weren't noticed. Always aware that she was risking everything, her life, her sister's life, the fragile security that came from being valuable property for something that could never have a future. The first person to sense something wrong was Patience, Cora's younger sister. She worked in the main house as a chambermaid and came to the kitchen house one September evening to borrow supplies. She found Cora staring into nothing with an expression Patience had never seen on her sister's face before, something between joy and absolute terror. "What's happening?" Patience asked directly, because they'd grown up in slavery, learning that indirect questions wasted time they didn't have. Cora looked at her sister and understood she couldn't lie. "I need you to promise you'll never speak of this to anyone." "I promise. Mistress Margaret and I." Cora's voice broke. "We've become close." Patience was 22 years old and had lived her entire life reading danger in white people's moods and actions. She understood immediately what close meant, and her face went pale. "She's going to get you killed," she said flatly. "Whatever she's told you, whatever she's made you feel, it doesn't matter. She's white and you're not, and that's the only thing that will matter when this ends." "It might not end," Cora said, knowing even as she spoke that she was lying to herself. "It always ends," Patience said, her voice urgent. "Everything we care about, they take it away. That's what they do. That's what this system does." Patience was speaking from experience. Their mother had died when Patience was 15. Their older brother had been sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi when Patience was 10, and they'd never heard from him again. Their father had been a man from a neighboring estate who'd been sold before Patience was born. They had both learned that attachment in slavery meant loss, that love was just another way to suffer. But knowing something intellectually and being able to act on that knowledge are entirely different things. Cora continued seeing Margaret, continued building something that had no name in their language, no legal recognition, no possible future except destruction. They became more reckless, more desperate to squeeze meaning from the limited time they had. Margaret began coming to the kitchen house late at night after James had fallen asleep. She'd slip out through the servants' entrance, cross the yard in darkness, and they'd stay together until just before dawn, when Cora would have to begin breakfast preparations. They existed in those stolen hours as if morning would never come, as if the world beyond the kitchen house walls had ceased to exist. The change in Margaret was visible to anyone paying attention. She moved differently, smiled at odd moments, seemed lit from within by something that made her more vivid, more present. The neighboring plantation wives, during their infrequent visits, commented to each other about how much happier Margaret seemed, how marriage must be agreeing with her after all. Thomas, on the rare occasions he was home and attentive, assumed his wife's improved spirits reflected her adjustment to her proper role. No one suspected the truth, because the truth was, by definition, impossible. White women did not feel desire for enslaved women. Enslaved women had no desires beyond survival. These were facts as fundamental as the sun rising, as unquestionable as scripture. To doubt them was to doubt the entire architecture of civilization. But impossible things happen every day, and by October of 1853, what Margaret and Cora felt for each other had developed into something both recognized as love, though neither could safely speak that word aloud. They made plans that couldn't work, fantasies about escaping north, about somehow purchasing Cora's freedom, about running away together to a place where no one knew them. Margaret had a small inheritance from her grandmother, money that was technically hers, though controlled by James. She imagined scenarios where she could access that money, where they could disappear, where they could live as two women running a boarding house in some northern city where no one asked too many questions. These plans were delusions built on desperation, but delusion becomes necessary when reality offers nothing but slow suffocation. The beginning of the end came in November 1853, when James's mother, Charlotte Bellmont, came to stay at the estate. Charlotte was 64, widowed, sharp-eyed, and deeply invested in maintaining the family's social position. She'd raised James to believe that proper order was the foundation of civilization, and she had a talent for detecting any disruption to that order. Charlotte noticed immediately that something was off. She noticed how often Margaret visited the kitchen house. She noticed how Cora's expression changed when Margaret entered a room. She noticed small, unconscious gestures of intimacy, how Margaret touched Cora's arm while discussing menus, how Cora smiled at something Margaret said in a way that went beyond servant deference. Individually, these observations meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern that Charlotte recognized because she'd lived in the South her entire life and understood the hidden architecture of plantation households. She understood the secret relationships white men conducted with enslaved women, the way power and desire twisted into forms that society officially denied while privately tolerating. What she observed between Margaret and Cora wasn't quite that, but it was something, and something was dangerous enough to require investigation. Charlotte began watching more carefully. She started appearing in the kitchen house at unexpected times. She asked pointed questions about Margaret's schedule. She created situations designed to reveal what she suspected, and Margaret, who'd grown comfortable thinking of the kitchen house as a safe space, failed to recognize the danger until it was too late. The discovery happened on a cold December night. Charlotte woke past midnight and noticed lamplight still burning in the kitchen house. She dressed and walked across the yard, telling herself she was investigating a potential fire hazard. What she found when she opened the kitchen house door without knocking was Margaret and Cora standing close together, Margaret's hand on Cora's face in a gesture that was unmistakably intimate, unmistakably tender, unmistakably everything that should not exist between them. The three women froze in a tableau that seemed to last forever. Charlotte's expression moved from confusion to comprehension to absolute horror. Margaret stepped back from Cora as if burned, her face draining of color. Cora immediately dropped her eyes to the floor, every survival instinct screaming at her to appear as differential, as non-threatening, as invisible as possible. "Charlotte," Margaret started, her voice shaking, "this isn't—" "It's exactly what it appears to be," Charlotte said, and her voice was cold and precise as a surgical blade. "You have disgraced yourself, disgraced this family, and contaminated this household with perversion that I cannot even adequately name." The word hung in the air like poison. Perversion. Not love, not connection, not relationship. Perversion. The word that erased everything real and replaced it with sin and sickness. "Please," Margaret whispered, "please don't tell James." Charlotte looked at her daughter-in-law with something that might have been pity if pity weren't overwhelmed by contempt and genuine confusion. "What you've done gives me no choice. This is not some minor indiscretion. James must know. That creature," she gestured at Cora without looking at her, "must be removed from this property immediately." "No," Margaret said, and the desperation in her voice revealed everything Charlotte suspected and more. "Please, I'll do anything." "You'll do nothing," Charlotte said sharply. "You have no authority here. You are James's wife, and when he learns what you've done with his property, you may not even be that for much longer. I will speak with him in the morning." But Charlotte didn't leave immediately. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen house, studying the two women before her with the fascinated horror of someone witnessing something she'd been taught could not exist. Her eyes moved from Margaret's tear-streaked face to Cora's rigidly controlled posture, and something new seemed to dawn in her expression. "How long?" Charlotte asked quietly, and the question carried more weight than her previous anger. "How long has this contamination existed in my son's house?" Margaret opened her mouth, but no words emerged. It was Cora who spoke, her voice barely audible, her eyes still fixed on the floor in the posture of absolute submission. "It's my fault, ma'am. I took advantage of Mrs. Belmont's loneliness. I deceived her. She's innocent in this." "Don't," Margaret said sharply, finding her voice. "Don't lie for me, Charlotte. Whatever you think of me, whatever James will do, I won't let Cora take blame that isn't hers. This was both of us. I wanted," her voice broke, "I wanted this as much as she did." Charlotte's expression shifted from horror to something more complex, a mixture of disgust and genuine bewilderment. In her world, desire between women was theoretically possible, but considered a temporary aberration, something that occurred in the absence of proper male guidance and evaporated once that guidance was restored. What she was witnessing suggested something far more substantial. Margaret wasn't speaking like a woman who'd been corrupted. She was speaking like a woman defending someone she loved. "You're telling me," Charlotte said slowly, as if testing each word, "that you chose this? That you, a white woman of good family, deliberately sought intimacy with a slave?" "Yes," Margaret said, and despite her terror, there was defiance in her voice. "I chose it. I chose her. I know you can't understand that, but it's the truth." Charlotte shook her head, not in disbelief, but in a kind of appalled wonder. "Then you're more lost than I imagined. James will have this marriage annulled if possible. You'll return to Mobile in absolute disgrace, and that thing," she looked at Cora properly for the first time, "will be sold so far south she'll never contaminate another household." "She has a name," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength even as tears continued streaming down her face. "Her name is Cora. She's a person. She feels, she thinks, she—" "She is property," Charlotte interrupted with brutal finality. "And you have allowed yourself to forget that fundamental distinction, with consequences that will destroy you both. I almost pity you, Margaret. You've thrown away everything, your position, your reputation, your future, for something that was never real and could never last." "It was real," Margaret said quietly. "Whatever happens now, whatever you tell James, whatever he does to us, it was real. What we felt for each other was real." Charlotte turned and left without another word, her footsteps echoing across the frozen yard as she returned to the main house. The door closing behind her sounded final, absolute, like the ceiling of a tomb. As soon as they were alone, Margaret reached for Cora, but Cora stepped back, creating distance that felt like a physical wound. "Don't," Cora said, and her voice was flat, drained of all emotion. "It's over. It has to be over. Maybe we can still if we say nothing happened, if we deny." "She saw us," Margaret said, and she was crying again, the tears coming so fast she could barely speak. "She saw us, and she'll tell James, and he'll— oh God, what will he do to you?" That was the question that mattered. James Belmont owned Cora completely, absolutely, without limitation. He could have her whipped, he could have her sold. He could have her killed if he determined she had violated his property rights by contaminating his wife. The law was entirely on his side. Enslaved people had no legal recourse, no rights, no protection from anything an owner chose to do. "You need to go," Cora said quietly. "You need to go back to the house right now, and we need to never speak of this again. Tell them I deceived you. Tell them I took advantage of your kindness. Tell them whatever you need to tell them to protect yourself." "I won't lie about you," Margaret said. "I won't let them hurt you." Cora looked at Margaret with an expression that held both love and absolute clarity about their situation. "You can't stop them," she said. "You never could. That's what I've been trying to make you understand. We were always living on borrowed time, and the time just ran out." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could protect Cora, that her position as James's wife gave her some authority. But Cora's expression told her the brutal truth. White women had no power in this system except what men allowed them, and that power evaporated the instant they violated the rules that sustained their privilege. They stood facing each other in the kitchen house that had been their sanctuary, and both understood this was goodbye. Margaret reached out once more, and this time Cora allowed it. Let Margaret take her hand and hold it for a few seconds that had to contain everything they couldn't say. "I love you," Margaret whispered. "Whatever happens, know that I love you." Cora nodded, not trusting her voice, and then gently pulled her hand away. "Go," she said, "please, just go." Margaret left, walking back across the dark yard to the main house where everything was about to collapse. Cora stood alone in the kitchen house, staring at the dying fire, and understood with perfect clarity that her life was over. Either she would be sold away, separated from patients and everything she knew, or worse, things would happen. Things she'd heard whispered about, but never witnessed directly. The best she could hope for was that patients would be spared, that whatever punishment came would fall only on her. She thought about running. There were networks, people who helped fugitives reach the north, routes that led through the swamps to Mobile, then by ship to free states. But running meant abandoning. Patience meant making herself a criminal, meant living as hunted prey for whatever remained of her life. And part of her, the part that was too tired and too heartbroken to keep fighting, wondered if survival was even worth what it would cost. Morning came too quickly. Cora went through the motions of preparing breakfast, her hands moving automatically through tasks she'd performed 10,000 times. The other kitchen workers knew something was catastrophically wrong but were too frightened to ask. Fear spread quickly in slave quarters. Everyone understood that when trouble came to one person, it could metastasize to everyone. James Belmont learned everything over breakfast. Charlotte told him with clinical precision, sparing no detail. She described what she had seen, what she suspected had been happening for months, and what needed to be done immediately to restore order and propriety to the household. James's reaction was not explosive rage, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous, a sense of his fundamental authority being challenged. His wife had betrayed him with his property. The natural order had been inverted. What he had believed was his to control had revealed itself as chaotic and ungovernable. This was not just personal insult, but a threat to everything he understood about the world and his place in it. He sent for Margaret first. She came to his study, her face pale, her hands trembling. He did not invite her to sit. "Is what my mother described true?" he asked, and his voice was terrifyingly calm. Margaret understood that lying was pointless. "Yes," she said quietly. "How long?" "Since August." "And you?" He paused, as if the words themselves were difficult to form. You felt affection for this slave? I love her, Margaret said, because at this point there was nothing left to protect. I know you can't understand that, but it's true. I love her. James struck her, not violently enough to cause serious injury, but hard enough to assert absolute authority, to punish insubordination, to physically remind her of her place. Margaret staggered back, holding her face, and James pointed at her with a rigid finger. You will never speak those words again, he said. You will remain in this house. You will see no one. You will write no letters. I will decide later what is to be done with you, but for now, you will be confined to your room, and you will thank God that I don't exercise my legal right to divorce you for this abomination and send you back to your family in complete disgrace. He called for a house servant to escort Margaret to her room. Then he sent for his overseer, a man named Garrett, who had managed Belmont's field operations for 15 years with efficient brutality. The cook, Cora, James said. She has contaminated my household with her influence over my wife. She must be sold immediately. I want her off this property within 2 days. Garrett nodded. This was familiar territory. Disobedient property being removed. I'll contact the dealers in Mobile. Won't get top price on such short notice, but I don't care about price, James said. I want her sold deep south, Louisiana sugar plantations. Somewhere, she will never have opportunity to spread her corruption or to maintain any connection to this place. Make it absolutely clear to the dealers that this is essential. Being sold to Louisiana sugar plantations meant death, just death that took years instead of minutes. The work was brutal beyond description. Enslaved people died there at rates that made them profitable to work to death and replace rather than maintain. It was understood as one of the worst fates possible within slavery. And her sister, Garrett asked, Patience? She works in the house. James considered. Keep her for now. She's competent. But make it clear to her that her sister's disgrace has been noted, and any disruption from her will result in immediate sale. Cora learned her fate that afternoon. Garrett came to the kitchen house and told her, with the casual tone of someone conveying routine information, that she would be sold in 2 days. She had until then to prepare herself and say goodbye to anyone she needed to say goodbye to. Cora's first thought was of Patience. She found her sister in the main house during the brief evening break and told her what was happening. Patience, who had predicted exactly this outcome, took her sister's hands and pressed her forehead to Cora's. I'm sorry, Cora whispered. I'm so sorry I did this to you. Don't, Patience said fiercely. Don't apologize for being human. Don't apologize for wanting something for yourself. This isn't your fault. It's theirs. It's this whole evil system. Promise me you'll be careful, Cora said. Don't do anything that gives them reason to hurt you. I'll find you, Patience said. Somehow, someday, I'll find you. They both knew this was a lie, a comfort that couldn't survive contact with reality. Once enslaved people were sold to Louisiana, they disappeared as completely as if they'd died. The distances were too great, the documentation too sparse, the system too deliberately designed to prevent families from ever reconnecting. They held each other until the overseer's bell rang, calling everyone back to work. Then Patience returned to the house and Cora returned to the kitchen for what would be her last night there. She thought about trying to see Margaret one more time, about trying to say a proper goodbye, but she knew it was impossible. Margaret was confined to her room, guarded specifically to prevent that kind of contact. Whatever final words they might have shared would remain unspoken. Instead, Cora sat in the kitchen house she had managed for 6 years, surrounded by the tools of her trade, and tried to prepare herself mentally for what came next. She had heard stories about Louisiana sugar plantations. Everyone had. The work was harder, the conditions worse, the death rate catastrophic. Enslaved people were worked literally to death and replaced from the steady stream of new purchases. She was being sent there not just to be sold, but to be destroyed, slowly and systematically. She could run. She had 2 days. The nights were long in December. She knew the plantation's layout perfectly, knew the swamps, knew which roads led to Mobile. She could be miles away before anyone noticed. But running meant abandoning, patience to potential retaliation. James Belmont had already made clear that Patience's security depended on Cora's compliance. Her sister's safety was the chain that bound her more effectively than any iron. She sat with that impossible choice for hours, weighing near certain terrible death against a slim chance at freedom that required abandoning the only family she had left. This was how the system functioned. Using people's love for each other as weapons, using the bonds between family members as shackles more effective than anything physical. Near midnight, something extraordinary happened. The kitchen house door opened quietly, and Margaret slipped inside. She had managed to bribe a house servant, had climbed out her window, had crossed the yard in darkness. She looked terrified and desperate and absolutely determined. "I had to see you," she said. "I couldn't let you go without." Cora stood and crossed to her, and they held each other with the intensity of people who know they will never touch again. No words were adequate. They had both known from the beginning that this couldn't last, that the world they lived in would eventually destroy what they had built. Knowing it didn't make it hurt less. "Come with me," Margaret whispered desperately. "We'll run together. We'll go north. We'll—" "You know I can't," Cora said gently. "If I run, Patience suffers. They'll take it out on her. And you, Margaret, you're white. You have options I'll never have. You can survive this. You can eventually leave James, go back to your family, start over somehow." "I don't want to survive without you," Margaret said, and she was crying, her tears soaking into Cora's shoulder. "You have to," Cora said, "because one of us surviving is better than both of us destroyed. Promise me you'll survive this. Promise me you'll find some way to live." Margaret pulled back and looked at Cora's face, trying to memorize it, trying to hold on to something that could never be preserved. "I love you," she said. "I will always love you. Nothing they do, nothing they say, nothing that happens will ever change that." "I know," Cora said. "I love you too. That's why you have to go back to the house now, before anyone notices you're gone. That's why we have to let this end." They kissed one last time, and it was gentle and desperate and absolutely final. Then Cora physically turned Margaret toward the door and pushed her gently toward it. "Go," she said. "Please, if you love me, go." Margaret went, looking back once from the doorway, her face illuminated briefly by lamplight. Then she was gone into the darkness, and Cora stood alone in the kitchen house and allowed herself for the first time to fully acknowledge her grief. She had lost everything: her home, her sister, her love, her future. All that remained was the certainty of suffering ahead. Dawn came with terrible clarity. A slave dealer from Mobile arrived with chains and paperwork. Cora was given no time to gather belongings because enslaved people owned nothing. She was simply property being transferred from one owner to another. The dealer, a man named Hutchins, who had transported human cargo for 20 years, chained her wrists. Unnecessary since she wasn't resisting, but required by procedure. He led her to his wagon, where 3 other enslaved people already sat, all of them being sold to Louisiana for various infractions, real or imagined. Patience was there, having been given permission to say goodbye. She embraced her sister, and Cora felt her tears hot against her neck. "Be strong," Cora whispered to her. "Survive. That's all we can do. Survive, and remember each other." "I won't forget you," Patience said, her voice breaking. "I swear I won't forget." Hutchins pulled Cora away and helped her into the wagon with businesslike efficiency that demonstrated how routine this was for him. He had transported thousands of enslaved people, had witnessed thousands of these goodbyes. They meant nothing to him because in his world these were not people but merchandise that sometimes inconveniently displayed emotion. As the wagon pulled away from Belmont House, Cora looked back once. She saw the kitchen house where she had spent the happiest and most painful months of her life. She saw Patience standing in the yard, her hand raised in farewell, and she saw, in an upper window of the main house, a pale face pressed against the glass. Margaret, watching her leave, unable to do anything but witness. Then the wagon turned onto the road and Belmont House disappeared from view. Cora faced forward and tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. She had been sold to Louisiana. She would probably die there. But she had lived, for a brief time, as something more than property. She had loved and been loved in return. In a system designed to reduce people to objects, she and Margaret had created something undeniably human. Whether that was worth the price she was about to pay, she didn't know. But it was too late for such questions. The choice had been made. The consequences were unfolding. All that remained was endurance. The journey to Mobile took 2 days. Cora traveled in Hutchins' wagon with the 3 other enslaved people. A young man sold for attempted escape, a woman sold for theft, and an older man whose only crime was being too expensive to maintain in his declining years. Hutchins maintained professional efficiency. He fed them enough to keep them healthy for sale, chained them securely enough to prevent escape, but not so tightly as to leave visible marks that might reduce value, and spoke to them in the tone one might use with livestock. During those 2 days, Cora existed in a strange state between grief and numbness. Everything she had known receded behind her with every mile. The other captives in the wagon spoke little, each absorbed in their own devastation. The woman sang quietly sometimes, old songs that Cora recognized from her mother, songs that had traveled from Africa to America in the holds of slave ships and persisted because people needed something beautiful to hold on to in the midst of absolute powerlessness. At the mobile auction house, Cora was processed like merchandise. Dealers examined her teeth, her hands, her body. They asked questions about her skills and health history. Hutchins, who had her documentation from James Belmont, emphasized her cooking abilities, her literacy, her proven reliability. He mentioned nothing about why she was being sold, though experienced dealers could usually guess. Sudden sales of valuable domestic slaves often indicated transgression, and the fact that she was being sent specifically to Louisiana sugar country told them everything they needed to know. This was punishment, not business. Cora was purchased within 3 days by a dealer named Simmons, who specialized in supplying Louisiana plantations. The price was $680, significantly less than her actual value, but Hutchins had been instructed to sell quickly rather than wait for optimal prices. Simmons chained 20 people together and began the journey west, moving by steamboat up the Mobile River, then overland to Montgomery, then by boat again down to New Orleans and up into sugar country. The journey took weeks. People died, a young woman from fever, a man from injuries sustained when he tried to escape and was caught. Their bodies were disposed of with minimal ceremony, and the chain line moved on. Cora watched and understood that this was her future now. A world where death was common enough to be unremarkable, where people vanished without record or memorial, where the only thing that mattered was whether enough laborers survived to make the journey profitable. Meanwhile, at Belmont House, events unfolded with their own terrible momentum. James kept Margaret confined to her room as he had promised, but over the following days he struggled with a problem that challenged his understanding of proper action. Divorce required public proceedings and public explanations. To divorce Margaret, he would have to document her transgression, and documenting it meant admitting that his authority had been so thoroughly undermined in his own household. It meant acknowledging that his wife had chosen intimacy with an enslaved woman over her duties to him. The humiliation would be absolute and public, the scandal impossible to contain. But keeping Margaret created its own problems. She was openly defiant, refusing to express remorse, refusing to pretend the relationship had been anything other than genuine love. When James demanded she acknowledge her sin and beg forgiveness, Margaret looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only exhausted contempt. "You want me to say I was deceived?" she said quietly during one of his visits to her locked room. "You want me to say Cora corrupted me, that I was an innocent victim? I won't give you that lie. I loved her, I chose her, and I would choose her again, even knowing how this would end." Her honesty was almost incomprehensible to James. In his experience, women might commit indiscretions, but they always had the grace to pretend remorse, to participate in the fiction that allowed society to function smoothly. Margaret's refusal to do so made her more dangerous than a simple adulteress. She was challenging the fundamental order, insisting that an enslaved person was worthy of love, that such love was real and defensible and worth the consequences. James consulted with his mother and with 2 neighboring planters whose discretion he trusted. All agreed that public divorce would damage him more than Margaret. Instead, they counseled isolation. Keep Margaret confined, limit her contact with the outside world, and eventually the scandal would fade into rumor that could be denied. In a few years, if Margaret could be brought to show appropriate contrition, some limited social rehabilitation might be possible. But Margaret had no intention of rehabilitation. 3 days after Cora was sold, she began refusing food. Not dramatically, not with announced intention, but simply pushing away plates and saying she wasn't hungry. By the 5th day, James noticed and sent the household physician to examine her. Dr. Crawford found Margaret physically healthy, but displaying what he delicately termed severe melancholia of character. He recommended forced feeding if she continued to refuse nourishment, but also suggested that such extreme measures might not be successful if the patient was truly determined. Margaret was indeed determined. She had discovered that the only power she retained was the power to refuse. Refuse food, refuse contrition, refuse to continue living in a world that had destroyed the one thing she valued. It was a slow form of suicide, and she pursued it with the same intensity she had once pursued Cora's love. By the 2nd week, she was visibly weakened, her face gaunt, her hands trembling. The house servants whispered about her condition, and word eventually reached Patience in the kitchen. She requested permission to see Mrs. Belmont, ostensibly to apologize for her sister's corruption of the mistress, and James, thinking this might shame Margaret into proper behavior, allowed it. Patience was brought to Margaret's room under guard. She found Margaret sitting by the window, thin and pale, staring out at the kitchen house where everything had happened. When Margaret saw Patience, her carefully maintained composure crumbled. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. "I'm so sorry. I tried to protect her and I failed. I failed you both." Patience, who had every reason to hate this white woman whose selfish desire had destroyed her sister, looked at Margaret and saw only shared grief. "She loved you," Patience said quietly. "Whatever happens to either of us, you need to know that. She loved you, and she never regretted loving you, even knowing it would end this way." "How do you know?" Margaret asked desperately. "How can you know that?" "Because I'm her sister," Patience said. "Because I knew her better than anyone except maybe you. And because the night before they took her, she told me that knowing you, really knowing you, was worth whatever came after." Those words, meant as comfort, broke something fundamental in Margaret. She had been holding on to the possibility that she had ruined Cora's life for nothing, that Cora might regret their relationship, might wish it had never happened. Learning that Cora had considered it worthwhile made the loss unbearable rather than easier to bear. After Patience left, Margaret wrote 3 letters. One was to her sister in Mobile, describing what had happened and asking forgiveness for the disgrace she had brought on the family. The second was to James, requesting that after her death she be buried in the small cemetery behind the plantation rather than in the family plot, and that a simple stone mark her grave with only her name and dates. The third letter was to Cora, though Margaret knew it would never be delivered. Enslaved people sold to Louisiana rarely received correspondence, and even if someone tried to send it, there was no way to trace where Cora had ended up. She might be on any of 100 plantations scattered across the sugar country. She might already be dead. In the letter to Cora, Margaret wrote everything she hadn't been able to say in their last moments together. She wrote about the impossibility of continuing in a world that insisted their love had never been real. She wrote about her certainty that what they had shared was more genuine than any sanctioned relationship she might have had. She wrote about her choice, because it was a choice, to follow Cora into whatever came after this life, rather than spend decades living as a shell of the person she had briefly been allowed to become. She sealed all 3 letters and hid them in a small box beneath a loose floorboard in her room, knowing they would eventually be found, knowing they would serve as testament when there were no other witnesses. That night, Margaret took the laudanum that Dr. Crawford had prescribed for her distress. She had been saving doses for days, accumulating enough to ensure the outcome she desired. She swallowed the bitter liquid methodically, all of it, and then lay down on her bed to wait. The house servants found her the next morning. She was already cold, already beyond any intervention. Her face held an expression that those who saw it described as peaceful, the first peace she had known since Cora's sale. James Belmont, confronted with a dead wife and a scandal that had to be contained, chose to bury everything. Catherine's body, the truth about what had happened, his own humiliation. He attributed her death to illness, a fever that had taken her suddenly. He destroyed the letters Margaret had written, burned them without reading them fully, though he saw enough to understand they documented her relationship with Cora. He destroyed any journals she had kept, anything that might have provided evidence of what had occurred. Within a month, he had courtship negotiations underway with another mobile merchant's daughter. Within 6 months, he had remarried. Life at Belmont House continued as if Margaret had never existed. But Patience knew the truth. She had spoken with house servants who had found Margaret's body, who had heard her speaking Cora's name in her final fevered moments. She knew her sister had been sent to Louisiana to die slowly, and she knew that Margaret had chosen to die quickly rather than survive without her. The knowledge changed something fundamental in Patience. She had endured slavery by believing that survival was itself a form of resistance, that staying alive was a way of refusing to let the system win completely. But watching her sister sold away, watching the woman she loved choose death, made survival feel less like resistance and more like collaboration with her own destruction. 4 weeks after Margaret's death, Patience ran. She disappeared from Belmont House in the middle of the night, taking only what she could carry, following routes she had learned from whispered conversations in the slave quarters. James Belmont hired slave catchers, posted notices, offered rewards. But Patience had simply vanished. Whether she made it north, whether she died in the attempt, whether she was caught and killed so far from Belmont House that word never made it back, no one knows. The records show only that in February 1854, James Belmont filed paperwork recording a financial loss due to a fugitive slave valued at $650. That single line in a ledger is the only official acknowledgement that Patience ever existed. As for Cora, she disappears from the historical record entirely after her sale in December 1853. The mobile auction house records show her being sold to a dealer who supplied plantations in Louisiana. After that, there is nothing. No further documentation, no record of sale to a specific plantation, no death certificate, nothing. She could have died on the journey to Louisiana, one of the many who didn't survive the brutal transport conditions. She could have died in her first year on a sugar plantation, as so many did, worked literally to death, in conditions designed to extract maximum labor before replacement. She could have survived for years, even decades, her story lost in the deliberate absence of records that might have documented enslaved people's lives as anything other than property transactions. But in the fragmentary Louisiana plantation records that survive, there are occasional hints of resistance. Women who poisoned overseers' food, women who taught others to read despite prohibitions. Women who maintained dignity and humanity despite every systematic effort to destroy it. Perhaps Cora was one of these women. Perhaps she carried what Margaret had given her, the knowledge that she was fully human, fully capable of love, and being loved into a system designed to deny that truth. Perhaps that knowledge was itself a form of resistance, a refusal to internalize the lies slavery required to function. The truth is, we don't know. The historical record is silent because the people who kept records didn't consider enslaved people's inner lives worth documenting. They recorded purchases, sales, births that added to property value, deaths that represented financial losses. They did not record love, grief, resistance, or hope, because acknowledging those things would have required acknowledging full humanity. What we can know is this: something happened at Belmont House between Margaret Bellmont and the enslaved woman Cora that was powerful enough to lead to 2 deaths and a disappearance. Something happened that required elaborate cover-ups, destroyed letters, and deliberate erasure from official records. Something happened that made those who witnessed it uncomfortable enough to never speak of it again. That something was love. Forbidden, impossible, doomed, but undeniably real. And the fact that such love could exist under slavery, that it could drive people to choose death over separation, tells us more about the human capacity for connection than any philosophical argument ever could. It tells us that people are capable of recognizing each other's humanity across any barrier, that we are capable of love even when love requires us to destroy ourselves, that we are capable of choosing genuine feeling over safety, connection over survival, our authentic selves over the roles society insists we inhabit. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if these buried truths matter to you, then I need you to do something. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who understands that history isn't just dates and battles, but real people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Hit that like button to tell YouTube that stories like this deserve to be amplified. And if you haven't already, subscribe to The Sealed Room, because we're going to keep digging up the stories that powerful people wanted to stay buried. The stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about what this country was built on and what people were capable of feeling, despite laws and customs designed to make such feelings impossible. This is why Margaret and Cora's story had to be buried, because acknowledging that such love existed required acknowledging that slavery was not just economically cruel, but philosophically incoherent. You cannot love someone as property. You cannot recognize someone's full humanity and still enslave them. The two positions are absolutely incompatible, mutually exclusive, impossible to reconcile. Margaret and Cora discovered that incompatibility and paid for that discovery with their lives. They loved each other in a world that insisted such love was impossible, unnatural, perverse, and when that world could no longer ignore what they had created, it destroyed them with brutal efficiency. But it couldn't destroy the truth of what had existed between them. That truth survived in whispered stories, in fragments of burned journals, in the memory of people like Patience who carried it with them. It survived because truth has a persistence that outlasts even the most determined efforts at erasure. James Belmont lived another 27 years. He never spoke of his first wife, Margaret. He raised children with his second wife, managed Belmont House through the Civil War, and died in 1880, financially ruined by abolition, but still clinging to the social position that had always defined his identity. Charlotte Belmont never spoke of what she had witnessed in the kitchen house that December night. She lived at Belmont House until her death in 1869, managing the household with rigid efficiency, ensuring that propriety was maintained and that no whisper of scandal ever threatened the family name again. The kitchen house still stands at what remains of Belmont Estate, though the plantation itself is now a historical site, one of dozens that dot the southern landscape as monuments to a past that Americans still struggle to honestly confront. Tour guides discuss the architecture, the agricultural practices, the role of plantations in the regional economy. They rarely discuss in any detail the lives of the enslaved people who made those plantations function. And they never discuss what happened between Margaret Bellmont and Cora in the winter of 1853. But if you visit the Belmont estate on a quiet day, if you stand in that kitchen house and let yourself imagine the lives lived there, you might understand why some truths get buried. You might understand why a system built on denying humanity had to destroy any evidence that humanity persisted despite that denial. Margaret and Cora's story matters not because it was unique, though the specific circumstances were unusual, but because it reveals the central lie at the heart of slavery. The system required white Southerners to believe that enslaved people were fundamentally different, incapable of the refined feelings that defined true humanity, suitable only for labor and obedience. But Margaret, raised in that system, taught those beliefs from childhood, discovered they were lies. She fell in love with someone she was supposed to regard as property, and that love was as real and as powerful as any love has ever been anywhere. The fact that such love was possible under slavery, that it happened despite every prohibition and every danger, tells us something essential about human nature. We are capable of recognizing each other across any barrier. We are capable of love, even when love means choosing destruction. We are capable of insisting on our shared humanity, even when the entire structure of society is organized to deny it. This is the real danger that Margaret and Cora represented. Not sexual impropriety, not violation of racial boundaries, but the simple insistence on loving each other despite being told such love was impossible. That insistence threatened the entire philosophical foundation of slavery, because if enslaved people could love and be loved as equals, if they could form connections as profound as any between free people, then the justifications for slavery collapsed completely. You cannot enslave your equal. You cannot own someone you recognize as fully human. The two positions cannot coexist. Slavery required constant reinforcement of difference, constant insistence that enslaved people were somehow less than fully human. Margaret and Cora's love demolished that insistence, and so it had to be destroyed. They loved each other, and they paid for that love with their lives. But the love itself was real. What they felt was genuine. What they created together in those stolen hours in the kitchen house was as valuable as anything human beings have ever created anywhere. And that matters. It matters that we remember them. It matters that we tell their story. It matters that we refuse to let the deliberate erasure stand. Because buried in that unmarked cemetery 3 miles from where Belmont House once stood are 2 women who insisted on being human when the world told them such humanity was impossible. One stone reads Margaret Elizabeth Bellmont, beloved daughter. The other reads simply Cora. They were buried on the same day, their graves so close the stones nearly touch. And in that proximity, in that final closeness that no one could prevent, there's a truth that survives all the cover-ups and all the destroyed evidence. They loved each other. They were willing to die rather than pretend that love didn't exist, and nothing anyone did then or since can erase that fundamental truth. What do you think about this story? Do you believe we've uncovered everything, or is there more still buried? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If this kind of historical investigation matters to you, if you want more stories that reveal what really happened when people loved each other despite impossible circumstances, then subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to hear it, because these stories matter, these lives matter, and we're going to keep digging until every buried truth sees light. See you in the next investigation.